1870. Alphonse Jaminet went down into the chamber that morning the way he had a dozen times before, spent a few hours down there, same as always, and came back up feeling like himself. By the time he reached his own home that afternoon, something in him had already broken. He couldn't stand right. He couldn't explain why. He was a physician, trained to recognize exactly this kind of collapse in other men, and he had no idea what was happening to his own. He had gone down there that morning specifically to prove the work was safe. Nobody warned him it might not be. Nobody could have. Nobody yet knew there was anything to warn him about. This is what it cost to put a bridge foundation on solid rock, in water too deep for a shovel and too fast for a machine that didn't exist yet. Not the cost in dollars, the cost in men. Nobody in America had ever tried to build anything at this depth before. Somebody had to go first, and somebody had to pay to find out what going first meant. Whatever they lowered into that river to do it, it didn't look like a machine. It looked like a coffin, big enough to hold 30 men, riding lower in the water than anything that size should. Men climbed down into it, convinced they would come back up the same men they went down as. Most of them were wrong, and not one of them could tell you why, not until it was already too late. It started killing people before anyone even had a word for what was killing them. Here's the part nobody down there could explain. Whatever this was, it didn't care how strong a man was, how careful he was, or how many times he had already done the job without a problem. It didn't seem to follow any rule anyone could find. What was it? And out of all the men still climbing down that stairwell every single morning, how many of them were about to find out the hard way? The 14 they couldn't explain. Start with the number that should not be possible. 119 men went down into that chamber under the Mississippi River in good health, and came back up carrying a disease that had no name and no known cure. 14 of them died. Not one of the 14 died inside the chamber. Every single one of them died after reaching the surface, some within the hour, some 5 days later, which meant a man climbing those stairs at the end of a shift had no way of knowing whether he had just survived the day or signed a death warrant with a slow fuse already lit inside him. One of the 14 was not even a hired laborer. He was 35 years old, and he went down for 2 hours purely out of curiosity, to see whether his own body could stand the pressure before he agreed to sign on for the job. His body stood the pressure fine. It was coming back up that killed him. 5 days later he was dead, and the doctors who opened him up found blood vessels in his brain and spine swollen tight with something dark and tar-thick that had no business being there. Whatever was happening to these men did not announce itself while they were underground. Down in the working chamber, by every account on record, the men felt fine. Better than fine, if visitors were to be believed. Something about the pressurized, oxygen-rich air down there put a giddy lift in a man's chest, an urge to laugh, for no reason at all. Candles refused to blow out properly. A man could pinch one 13 times in half a minute and watch the flame simply relight itself out of the pressurized air. None of that explained a single one of the 14 dead men above ground. It only made the mystery stranger. An environment that felt almost pleasant to be inside of was quietly building something lethal into the bodies of the men breathing it, and releasing that lethal thing only once they had already climbed back into daylight. 2 of the men who survived it never fully recovered the use of their own legs, disabled for the rest of their lives on a job that was supposed to end with a paycheck, not a permanent limp. The average man who fell seriously ill down there was 27 years old and had been on the job less than 2 months. Young, strong men, freshly hired, working an environment that had existed in America for exactly as long as this one bridge had been under construction. Nobody had built anything like it before, at anywhere near this depth, on this continent. Nobody had a manual for what was about to happen to them. Even the shallowest of these chambers went deeper than any sealed underwater chamber had ever been pushed anywhere on Earth. The deepest one hadn't even started its descent yet, and when it finally did, it would make every number in this chapter look conservative. Word of the deaths did not stay local either. East Coast papers picked up the story within weeks, turning a construction project in Missouri into a public argument over whether any bridge foundation was worth this many bodies. And 300 miles east, in the exact same season, a different engineer was floating a different iron box into a different river, confident his own design had already solved the problem the men of St. Louis were about to learn the hard way. He was wrong about that. He would pay for the mistake with the rest of his own body, and that story runs alongside this one all the way to the end. So what was actually happening to these men, 100 feet under two different rivers at once? Nobody in 1870 could tell you. This one starts with a river that nobody believed could be tamed, and a man too stubborn to accept that it couldn't be. The river that eats bridges. Every bridge ever proposed across the Mississippi at St. Louis had one enemy that had nothing to do with steel and everything to do with what was sitting underneath the water. The riverbed there was loose sand, packed over bedrock that lay more than 100 feet down in places. Sand that never once held still. James Eads understood this better than any engineer alive, because years before he ever drew a bridge, he had stood on the actual bottom of the Mississippi inside a diving bell, salvaging wrecks for a living. During a flood, 65 feet under, he felt the riverbed give way beneath his own boots, felt sand rushing past his hands like a current, even though a moment earlier he had been standing on what seemed like solid ground. He never forgot what that felt like, and it taught him something most bridge engineers of his era refused to accept. A pier resting on packed river sand had no permanent foundation at all, only a slow float on a bed, with the patience of a glacier and the loyalty of absolutely nobody. Other engineers wanted to drive wooden and iron pilings into that sand and call the job finished. It was cheaper. It was faster. It had worked, more or less, on smaller and gentler rivers. Eads refused outright. Scour a few feet of sand out from under a pier during flood season, and a bridge does not collapse right away. It leans, it settles, it cracks its own masonry a fraction of an inch at a time, until one day that fraction becomes a foot, and the whole structure comes down without warning, usually onto a moving train. Eads had watched the Mississippi to carve 41 feet of new depth into its own bed in a single season when the current wanted to. That is a wall of moving riverbed taller than a 4-story building, rearranging itself under the water in the time it takes to grow a season's crop. He was not going to trust his bridge or his name to ground that unreliable. He wanted actual bedrock, buried more than 100 feet beneath the water, and he intended to set his piers directly onto it, whatever that cost him. None of this addressed the fight Eads had to win before he ever sank a single caisson. Proposals for a bridge at St. Louis had circulated since the 1840s, and every one of them had drawn the fury of the city's steamboat operators, men who controlled the river trade and understood perfectly well that a bridge meant the beginning of the end for their monopoly. It took the bridge company 2 full years just to gain government approval, raise the necessary money, and quiet enough of the opposition to break ground at all. Steamboat money itself ended up inside the company by the time construction started. Once enough of the old guard decided that owning a piece of the railroad's future beat losing to it outright. That fight, at least, Eads won without ever getting wet. It cost him his credibility before it cost him a single dollar. Jacob Linville, a respected professional engineer, studied Eads's design and told him plainly that it would not stand up. A convention of the country's leading bridge builders, gathered in St. Louis that same summer, agreed that arches as long as Eads was proposing had no engineering precedent and no business being attempted. Eads had never built a bridge in his life. He had built ironclad gunboats for the Union Navy during the war, and made a private fortune hauling sunken cargo off the river floor before that. And he answered his critics the way a man answers when his mind is already made up, because a thing had never been done before did not make it impossible, not when the judgment and the arithmetic both said otherwise. The easiest ground came first, and it still nearly stopped the project before it began. On the Missouri side, bedrock sat close enough to the surface, under roughly 47 feet of water and mud, that Eads could build the traditional way. Crews sank a cofferdam, an iron-walled enclosure, pumped dry so men could dig in open air with ordinary shovels instead of underwater, and the dig ran almost immediately into a graveyard of wrecked steamboats, buried and rotting under the mud for who knew how many years. Weeks were lost, simply hauling out sunken hulls before anyone touched bedrock. It was miserable, filthy work. Compared to what came next, it was not dangerous work, because on the two piers standing in open water, the ones that actually carried the arches, bedrock did not sit at 47 feet. According to Eads's own borings, it fell away steadily as the river crossed east, from about 50 feet near the Missouri shore to nearly 130 feet on the Illinois side. No cofferdam ever built by human hands was going to survive that depth against the full current of the Mississippi. If Eads wanted bedrock under his river piers, and he did, he needed a method nobody in the country had ever used to build anything this large, this deep, or this fast. He had seen the answer in Europe, on a trip he took specifically to go looking for one. The French called it the pneumatic method, a sealed box open only at the bottom, sunk into a riverbed and kept dry inside by pumped-in compressed air instead of pumped-out water. Men could work directly on the riverbed itself, breathing pressurized air instead of drowning in river water, digging the ground out from beneath their own feet, while the box and the growing weight of masonry stacked on top of it forced the whole structure downward, inch by inch, toward the rock below. In France, that method had never been pushed past 85 feet. Eads was planning to push it past 130. He came home from Europe convinced it was the only method that could reach the depth he needed, and he had no idea yet what the compressed air itself was about to do to the men who breathed it. Somewhere in all of it, the borings, the fight with the steamboat men, the trip to Europe, was the reason a St. Louis physician named Alphonse Jaminet would end up paralyzed on his own study floor within 3 years. That part of the story hadn't happened yet. It was already loaded. The box that breathes. The caisson that went into the Mississippi first was, by any ordinary standard, an absurd piece of machinery. Picture an iron-plated timber box shaped like a stretched hexagon, 82 feet long and 60 feet wide, riveted over with iron plating 3/4 of an inch thick along its sides. Its roof alone carried 13 iron girders, each 5 feet tall, bolted down in parallel rows to keep the whole structure from buckling under everything it was about to carry. Finished, it weighed 437 tons, heavier than a fully loaded freight train, and it had not sunk a single inch yet. Getting it into position took a small fleet of its own. Steam tugs towed it upriver and anchored it in place with pilings driven 80 feet into the riverbed. Pontoon boats flanked it on either side, carrying 6 steam boilers, hoisting engines, hydraulic jacks, and a derrick 50 feet tall that would spend the following months swinging 7-ton blocks of limestone through the air and setting them down with a mason's precision. None of that surface machinery ever touched the river bottom. All of it existed to do one single thing: force that iron box downward, a few inches at a time, by piling stone on its roof faster than the men underneath could dig the ground out from under it. Here is the part that sounds backward, until you picture it happening. The caisson had no floor. It sat open at the bottom, directly against the mud, and inside that open chamber, compressed air held the entire river out, pumped in hard enough that the water simply could not force its way past the pressure and flood the space. Men descended a candle-lit spiral stairwell, squeezed through an oval hatch barely 2 feet wide, and climbed into an iron canister called an airlock, the only door between the ordinary world above and the pressurized one below. Once the outer hatch sealed, a valve let compressed air hiss into the lock until it matched the pressure of the chamber beyond. Only then did the inner door swing open on its own, and the men stepped out onto the actual bed of the Mississippi River, dry, lit by guttering candlelight, 30 men at a shift, shoveling wet sand into a pump of Eads's own invention that spat it back out into the river above them. As they dug, the caisson sank. As it sank, masons kept raising the stone pier on its roof, always racing to stay just above the waterline, so the pier's own growing weight did half the work of driving the box downward. Between the digging below and the masonry above, that first caisson settled as much as 20 inches in a single day. The west caisson, the second river pier, not the shallow abutment dug earlier by Cofferdam, was launched afterward on the 3rd of January 1870, somewhat smaller, 82 feet by 42, with only 5 airlocks instead of 7, but it faced the identical problem the east caisson did. Every foot it sank asked for more pressure than the foot before it, and depth was the one variable nobody underground could see coming. At the surface, ordinary air presses against a human body at about 15 pounds per square inch. 15 feet down inside the chamber, that pressure had barely doubled, and a trip through the airlock took about 2 minutes, long enough to feel a sharp earache and not much else. But the caisson did not stay at 15 feet. Every week it sank deeper, and by the time the east pier had gone 71 feet under, pressure inside had climbed past 33 pounds per square inch, and a routine visit through the lock now took 11 minutes of hissing, ear-splitting compressed air, with the temperature climbing 15 degrees as pressure built and then dropping just as violently coming back out. Men who rushed the exit valve to save time sometimes clocked a 32-degree swing in under 4 minutes. It was in that swing, that shock of pressure changing faster than a body could keep pace with, that the real danger was hiding, though nobody down there yet had the first idea that was true. That danger did not announce itself to anyone touring the chamber either. Eads once brought a party of 20 St. Louis residents down through the lock to inspect a telegraph line that had been strung into the working chamber, and the group spent half an hour marveling at the strangeness of it all. Voices came out pinched and nasal, a distortion the Missouri Republican described as a decidedly nasal twang, and champagne corks somehow tasted better in the pressurized air. Visitors tried whistling and simply could not manage it. Strangest of all to witness was what the engineers called a settling, the moment the caisson's entire mass, sometimes hundreds of tons of stone and iron together, suddenly shifted downward into the riverbed all at once. On the surface, it barely registered, an inch or two at most. To a visitor standing inside the chamber when it happened, the floor seemed to drop a full foot in an instant, stomach and all, right before someone reassured the room that this was, in fact, the entire point of the exercise. This still did not explain why men who felt perfectly fine underground kept dying hours after they left it. What was actually happening inside their bodies during that climb back to the surface? That question was about to get answered the hard way, in blood, and nobody topside was ready for the answer. Under enough air pressure, gas dissolves directly into blood and tissue, the same way carbon dioxide dissolves into a sealed bottle of soda water. Crack that seal slowly, and the gas escapes quietly through the neck of the bottle. Crack it open all at once, and the gas foams out everywhere, all at the same moment, wherever it happens to be sitting. That was the 14 dead men. Nitrogen, absorbed into their blood and joints and spinal fluid under all that pressure, boiling back out of solution the instant they returned to ordinary air, forming bubbles in places a bubble has no business existing. The small of the back, the base of the skull, the deep tissue wrapped around the heart. Not one engineer or doctor on that bridge understood a single word of that mechanism in 1870. They understood only the symptom: go down healthy, come up fine. Somewhere in the following hours, without any warning at all, start dying from the inside for reasons nobody could see or explain. The only tool anyone had against a threat nobody understood was almost comically simple: slow down. Shorter shifts, longer rest in between them. Smaller valves fitted into the airlock doors, so no impatient lock tender could rush a nervous new hire through a 5-minute pressure change just to watch him panic. It helped, somewhat. It never came close to solving anything, because the real cure, decompressing over the better part of an hour instead of a handful of frantic minutes, would not be understood by anyone on Earth for another 3 decades. In 1870, the men digging toward bedrock under the Mississippi were the unwitting test subjects for a science that did not exist yet, and the only instrument measuring the danger was the slowly growing number of bodies. You are 30 feet under the riverbed of the Mississippi River, and the candle beside you is burning with a strange, flattened flame that will not go out no matter how hard you blow on it. Your voice comes out thin and nasal, like you have a head cold that never clears. Somewhere above you, 30 tons of granite are settling onto the roof of the box you are standing inside of, and the whole structure groans and shifts an inch downward, and for one long second you feel the floor drop under your boots before it catches and holds again. Nothing hurts. Nothing feels wrong. That is exactly the problem, because whatever this air is doing to your body, it is not going to show itself until hours from now, somewhere far from this chamber, when there is nobody left down here to explain what happened to you. 30 men, 2 hours, no way out but down. The men who went down into that caisson were not, as a rule, native to St. Louis, and they were not hard to replace. Most were recent immigrants, Irish and German laborers pulled in by dockside word of mouth, men who took river-adjacent work because river-adjacent work was what a man without money or connections or fluent English could get. The bridge company paid by the shift, and outside the gate there was always another man waiting for a spot to open up, which meant nobody underground had much standing to complain, and even less incentive to admit when something felt wrong in his own body. Report dizziness or numbness in your legs, and you risked losing your place to the next man in line at the gate. So plenty of men said nothing. They finished a shift, told a foreman they felt fine, and went home to discover on their own whether fine had actually been true. At one point that spring, the men tried to press their advantage the only way they had left. They walked off the job together and demanded higher pay for work everybody now understood was killing people. Eads and the bridge company simply waited them out. St. Louis had no shortage of men looking for work, and after a few days without wages, the strikers filed back down the stairwell and returned to the chamber, because a man with a family to feed can only hold out so long against a company that can outweight him forever. Above ground, the remedies for the pains that followed a bad shift were about as scientific as they sound. Hot baths, patent liniments carrying names like Magic Oil and King of Pains, promising relief they rarely delivered. When those failed, plenty of men turned to something called a voltaic belt, a strip of zinc and silver plates strapped around the arms, the waist, even tucked beneath the soles of the feet, on the theory that a man's own sweat would trigger some kind of protective electrical current running through the metal. It did nothing. Nobody up there had access to anything that actually worked, because nobody up there, doctors included, had the first real idea what they were even trying to treat. Workers had their own name for the seizures that left a man bent forward at the waist for good, walking the rest of his life like an old man leaning into wind that wasn't blowing. They called it the Grecian bend, after a fashionable posture in women's dress that struck them as a fitting insult for what the disease had done to a grown man's spine. That is where Alphonse Jaminet came into the story, not as a hired safety officer, but as a curious friend. Jaminet was James Eads's personal physician, a man who had taken an interest in the caisson almost as a hobby, descending into the chamber more than once, simply to run his own experiments on how pressure changed the boiling point of water. Nobody had assigned him to protect the workforce. He was a scientist who happened to find the caisson fascinating, and he kept going back down long after any sensible man would have decided he had already seen enough of it. The maintenance side of the job was its own separate misery, entirely apart from anything happening inside a man's bloodstream. Leaks in the iron plating needed constant riveting and caulking, usually performed from inside the pressurized chamber by men who could not simply step outside for fresh air if something went wrong. The sand pump jammed often enough that clearing it became routine, no different from clearing a musket between shots, and every jam meant standing water rising around a crew's boots until the blockage cleared. Later, at the deepest of the caissons, an elevator was installed specifically to spare men the climb up 170 stairs at the end of a shift already spent digging. And when that elevator inevitably broke down, the men climbed anyway, exhausted, straight into the one part of the day when their bodies most needed rest instead of exertion. Crews worked shifts of 2 to 4 hours at a stretch, later cut shorter as the danger became clear, with roughly 30 men in the chamber at any given time under a handful of foremen, digging and shoveling and pumping around the clock, because a caisson that stopped sinking cost the company money every single day it sat still. The temperature inside the chamber was rarely the enemy. Through the coldest months it held around 45 to 50 degrees, and by spring it climbed to a mild 65 or 70, comfortable enough that the danger never announced itself through heat the way it might have in a boiler room or a foundry. That mildness was almost worse. A man had no physical signal telling him the air pressing on his body was doing anything to him at all, right up until the moment, hours later and far from the chamber, when it did. There was no calling in sick without consequence, and no clocking out early because a man's back ached. There was only the stairwell down, the hiss of the lock, and 30 men doing punishing physical labor inside an environment that not one person on the entire project, including the engineer who had designed it, fully understood yet. Between shifts, for the 2 hours a man had before his body went back down that stairwell, the pier was almost peaceful. Men sat wherever there was room and ate whatever they had brought, talking about anything except the work itself, news from home, a rumor about another job across town, nothing that mattered. Nobody talked about the ones who hadn't come back up right. For 2 hours at a stretch, the river below was just a river, and the box waiting under it was just a job. Word of the pain spreading through the crew reached the workers themselves the way rumors travel on any job site. Half accurate, whispered between shifts, dismissed by the men still lucky enough to feel fine that week. Somebody would go quiet for a day. Somebody else would come back to the pier bent forward at an angle that never straightened out again, and the rest of the crew would notice and say very little about it, because saying much meant admitting the next man down that stairwell could be you. Jaminet noticed too. He had watched the early cases come and go, treated a handful of them with nothing more effective than the same hot baths and useless liniments everyone else was already trying, and told himself, the way curious men often do, that understanding the mechanism was the only real answer worth chasing. He kept ascending into the chamber to observe it directly, certain that a man who understood pressure well enough could learn to master it. He was about to become the clearest, most personal proof on the entire project that understanding a danger and surviving it are two very different accomplishments. The morning two cities learned the same lesson. Shortly after 6 in the morning on the 28th of February, 1870, the cutting edge of the East Pier caisson touched solid rock, 95 feet below that day's waterline and 119 feet below the high water mark. A cannon fired 10 times from a barge moored nearby. Flags went up along the shoreline. Steamboats on the levee answered with their whistles, and by that afternoon, the city's biggest newspaper was already calling the hardest problem of the entire bridge solved, reporting that the rock had been reached without accident of any kind. For one bright morning, St. Louis genuinely believed the worst of it was already behind them. Jaminet had spent nearly 3 hours in that same chamber that day, running his own experiments on the bedrock they had just struck. Around noon, he climbed into the airlock alongside Eads himself, and as the two men waited for the pressure to drop, Eads did what he always did and opened the exit valve wide, rushing the descent from 45 pounds of pressure down to ordinary air in 3.5 minutes. Jaminet felt a sudden, sharp pain crack through his skull as the air thinned around him. By the time he reached the top of the pier, his pulse was racing. He made it onto a ferry, then to his own buggy, and drove himself home, where he collapsed in his study. He could not speak clearly enough to explain what was happening to his own body. He motioned for her to lay him flat on his back with his legs propped up. Both legs and his left arm had already stopped answering him. He held ice in his mouth against a thirst nothing seemed to satisfy, took spoonfuls of beef broth every few minutes, because it was the only remedy anyone thought to try, and lay on the floor of his own study for 3 straight hours, unable to tolerate so much as a hand adjusting his clothing, without the pain spiking hard enough to make him black out. It was evening before his pulse slowed. It was 9:30 that night before he could move his own legs again. He did not stand until the following morning, and even then, only long enough to shuffle a few unsteady steps across the floor. He recovered within the week, though slowly. For those 7 days he lay mostly still, in a curtained room, sipping broth, watching the light change through the window, in no condition to direct so much as a single mason. It was the closest thing to calm the whole project produced that spring. A great many of the men who worked that same chamber every single day were not nearly so fortunate. The worst of it began almost the moment Jaminet went down. Through March, nearly 20 of the most severely afflicted cases were sent to City Hospital for care the pier itself could not provide. Then, on a cold Saturday morning in the middle of that month, a laborer named James Riley climbed out of the stairwell after finishing a 2-hour shift, told a friend standing nearby that he felt perfectly fine, and within 15 minutes gasped, doubled over, and died where he stood. He had shown no sign of trouble on the stairs. He had joked with the man beside him, in no apparent distress at all, exactly the way dozens of other men had walked away from that same stairwell, feeling normal for weeks running. Nothing in his final 15 minutes gave anyone standing near him a reason to worry. A second man died in the hospital that same afternoon. Over the following week, 13 more so-called bridge cases came through the hospital doors. Most eventually recovered. 3 did not. The first autopsy performed on any of the dead took place the next day, on a 35-year-old man named James Moran. Moran had never even been a hired hand. He had gone down for 2 hours 5 days earlier purely to test his own body against the pressure, deciding whether the work was something he could stomach before agreeing to sign on. He decided he could stand it. He was wrong. The first pains hit almost as soon as he surfaced, and paralysis followed within hours. He spent 5 days dying in a hospital bed for a job he never actually started. What had actually killed him? When the surgeons opened him, they found blood vessels in his brain and spine swollen dark, packed with blood that had no business pooling where it was pooling, and tissue in his spinal cord gone soft in places, nearly to a pulp. None of it told them why. It only told them that something inside these men went catastrophically wrong on the way back to the surface, and nobody performing that autopsy had the faintest idea what it actually was. The very same week Riley died, 300 miles east. An engineer named Washington Roebling floated his own iron caisson into the East River for his own bridge, confident that what he had learned from Eads's design had already solved the danger St. Louis was drowning in. His caisson never went nearly as deep, stopping at 78 feet 6 inches, barely 2/3 of what the Mississippi was demanding of Eads. It did not matter. 3 of his men died the exact same way St. Louis's men were dying, and Roebling himself, insisting on staying down longer than anyone else to set an example for his crew, would pay for that decision with the rest of his own body before his bridge was even half finished, watching the remainder of its construction through a window and a telescope because his own legs would never again carry him across it. That story runs on its own well-known track. This one is the one nobody covered. The deeper river, the higher toll, and the doctor who nearly became one of the names on the list himself. By the end of March, a formal count showed several dozen serious cases and 11 deaths accumulated in barely 5 months of work. And the man the bridge company finally put in charge of stopping it was the same physician who had nearly died from it 3 weeks earlier, in his own study, on his own floor. What the Rock remembers. Jaminet took formal charge of the men's health on the 31st of March, 1870. A little over 3 weeks after the chamber had nearly killed him personally. He was, by then, the only man attached to the project who had experienced the disease from both sides of it, as a doctor treating strangers and as a patient screaming on his own floor. He went to work the only way he knew how, by measuring everything he could get an instrument on. Pulse rates before and after a shift, barometric pressure at every stage of descent, how many minutes a man spent crossing the airlock, even the specific gravity of urine collected from workers at different depths, on the theory that the body itself might be holding a clue nobody had thought to check for yet. His fixes were simple, almost stubbornly so. He cut the shifts from 3 hours down to 2, then further still, until by the following year, men were spending as little as 45 minutes at a stretch inside the chamber. He lengthened the rest periods between shifts and built berths on the pier so exhausted men could actually lie down instead of drinking their breakaway at a riverside bar. He installed smaller valves in the airlock doors, specifically so no impatient lock tender could rush a nervous new hire through a 5-minute pressure drop just to watch him panic. He examined every man before every single shift, turning away anyone who looked pale, unsteady, or worn thin, and in one recruiting push alone, he approved 64 applicants and rejected 67 others outright, for conditions ranging from epilepsy to what he simply wrote down as general debility. It worked, in the sense that the rate of serious cases slowed. It did not work in the sense that mattered most. A fourth chamber still remained after the 2 river piers were finished. The east abutment, anchoring the Illinois shoreline this time, not another river pier, and when it finally reached bedrock in the last days of March 1871, it had gone down 127 feet below high water, deeper than anything else on the entire bridge, deeper than any caisson yet attempted in America. Before that final chamber even began its descent, the city's biggest paper had assured its readers that with everything learned on the first 2 piers, the dangers of compressed air to workmen would soon be at an end forever in connection with this bridge. 28 more men were struck down before that last chamber sealed. 1 more died. By the time the final concrete had set, the tally on the entire project stood at 14 dead and 119 men seriously injured, out of a job that had run barely 2.5 years. Jaminet himself wrote, near the very end of it, that strict discipline and careful rules meant compressed air could be used with what he called comparative safety, even at the highest pressures the bridge had demanded of anyone. The number sitting directly underneath that sentence argued otherwise, and to his credit, Jaminet never once pretended it didn't. He never solved it. Neither did anyone else attached to that bridge. The real mechanism, nitrogen bubbling back out of blood and tissue when pressure drops faster than the body can release it, would not be understood by medical science for another 3 decades. Buried in this entire story is one particularly ugly irony. The basic warning had already been written down and published, 16 years before Eads ever broke ground on his bridge, by 2 French researchers studying accidents in compressed air coal mines. Their conclusion, translated plainly, was that the harm caused by decompression rises directly with how fast it happens. Had Eads read that paper, or had Jaminet found it before instead of after, some of the men digging toward bedrock under the Mississippi might have gone home to their families instead of to a hospital bed. Nobody attached to either bridge ever saw it. It sat quietly in a French scientific journal, correctly diagnosing a problem that had not been invented in America yet, while 14 men on the other side of an ocean died from precisely the thing it described in black and white. The bridge opened on the 4th of July, 1874, tested 2 days earlier by 14 borrowed locomotives weighing 550 tons combined, driven back and forth across the span for 5 straight hours, without so much as a groan out of the stonework underneath them. It still stands today, a national historic landmark, carrying trains and cars and pedestrians across the same river its foundations were bled into a century and a half ago, resting on bedrock that nobody has ever had to go back down and check, because on the one point that mattered most, Eads had been right from the start. Bedrock does not move. Nobody builds a bridge this way anymore, and nobody has to. Engineers today reach depths far past what Eads ever attempted without sending a single man into pressurized darkness with a shovel. Rigs position themselves over deep water using satellite guidance accurate to inches. Massive steel piles get driven straight to bedrock by hydraulic hammers, operated from a barge floating safely on the surface above. Where the ground will not take a driven pile, crews drill instead, holding the borehole open with a slurry of mud and water rather than a chest full of compressed air, then pour concrete straight down through it until the foundation is solid, all without one worker ever descending below the waterline. The rare pneumatic caisson still poured today runs on remote machinery, not human lungs and human blood. Sensors do the job Jaminet's stopwatch and his own aching body once tried to do, tracking pressure and depth in real time, and flagging trouble long before any human nervous system would notice it. None of that required inventing new physics. It required decades more of dead men, on this bridge and the ones that came after it, before the industry finally took the lesson seriously enough to retire the method altogether. A method that cost this bridge alone 14 names and a small crowd of ruined spines nobody ever properly counted. The rock is still down there holding up the same bridge it held up in 1874. The 14 men who reached it first are not remembered by name outside a handful of old hospital ledgers and one doctor's stubborn paperwork. Both of those facts are true at the same time, and neither one cancels out the other.